I found these rusty old saws in a box under a leak in the garage, and naturally decided to see if I could make a knife out of them. I first took off the handles, and then, using a wire wheel and a good respirator, I cleaned off as much of the rust as possible. Once they were clean, I found the longest 3 cm wide strips I could while avoiding as much of the pitting as possible. Once cut, they were cleaned up a little more using some sandpaper. I cut all but one of them to the same length and left the last one twice the length of the others in order to be able to wrap it around the others to hold them in place. Due to the thinness of the sheets, it took several heats in order to weld them all together, as otherwise the outer layers would melt before the insides were up to temperature. The middle of the bar was then marked, cut most of the way through, and folded over with plenty of floats. This weld took substantially less effort due to being 2 fairly thick layers instead of 10 thin ones. Once the weld had taken, I started drawing out the tang of the knife before shaping the tip. Once the basic shape was established, it was then drawn out using a crosspeen and smoothed over. After a few small refinements, it was then carefully annealed before rough grinding. Once I was happy with the basic bevels and the overall profile, it was carefully brought up to temperature, kept there for about 2 minutes, and then quenched in oil. As a rule of thumb, if a file can scratch the steel after the quench didn't work properly. Immediately afterwards, one side was very quickly cleaned up, and then the blade was tempered to a medium straw colour, which did not come out very well in the picture. Once the knife had cooled down, it was cleaned up on the large belt grinder, and then sharpened and polished to 240 grit on the small disc sander. After the blade was polished up to 400 grit by hand, it was then thoroughly cleaned with acetone and then placed in ferric chloride to bring out the pattern. Once the blade was finished, I started work on the grip, which I decided to make out of ebony and oak. I first cut a slot for the blade to sit in into the ebony and then sandwiched it between two pieces of oak. Once the first side was attached, the ebony was reduced to the same thickness as the tang, planed flat, and then sanded slightly. After all 3 bits of wood were glued together, the shape was sanded into existence. A little more epoxy and the grip is stuck onto the tank. Any excess epoxy is wiped off using acetone. Some Danish oil was applied to seal the wood and protect it from water damage. The most common test for the sharpness of a knife on YouTube seems to be cutting paper, but that's not generally what I use my knives for. Instead, I have this real-life test run. And there we are, 10 hours work to make a sandwich.